Yeah, no problem. On this new meeting, last time when I recorded, this pop-up came and said it's going to kick out Lynn when you start the recording.
Okay, no
I still don't
worries.
know why, but
And then it stopped working on my phone. I still haven't figured out why. Maybe I need
maybe
to
you have an
update
old,
my.
yeah, probably update.
Yeah, I will have to figure out how to do that. All right, so folks, welcome back from Thanksgiving. It's nice to see everybody. And today we have one item on the agenda. So if you do have item on the agenda now, it's a good time to add your items. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Yossi to talk about the first item on the agenda, Z-Tunnel Layer 4 policy review.
Yeah, let me just share that. Okay. We share this document with some kind of directions, so maybe some kind of information to trigger the discussion around supporting the layer 4 policies on Z-Tunnel, on the new implementation of the Z-Tunnel. And it's more about the a similar behavior, at least in my opinion, it should be like a similar behavior to what we have today in Istio, but keeping that only in the for the layer 4 policies. Over here, I have some background that most of you are probably already familiar with that, so I'm going to skip going over that in details, but I wanted to emphasize that currently the Istio authorization policy is some kind of mix. You can define in the authorization policy both layer 4 and layer 7 altogether. In the same resource policy, you can define rules that affect layer 4 and rules that affect layer 7, but on user experience or from user's perspective, it is not really aware of behind the scenes how we transform that Istio authorization policies into the Envoy filter configuration. So I kind of went through the possibilities of the definition for that authorization policies that we have today and marked the layer 4 attributes that we should, I think that we should support in the Z-Tunnel, and it summarized, we can sum up and get into this list of bolded attributes, which are all layer 4 relevant. And I believe that those are like the kind of attributes that most of the users expect us to support on the Z-Tunnels. Did I miss anything? No, okay. So today we are using the RBAC filters of Envoy to configure or support this kind of authorizations policies, and we use the RBAC filter on either on the HTTP on the HTTP listener or in the HTTP filter strings or in the network listener. And depending on we have some kind of a generator that depending on whether it's the information that we got in the authorization policy model whether it's layer 4, over there we call it TCP or not TCP. So if it's TCP, this is configuration that goes to the. I hope that you don't mind that I'm very briefly going over what we have today, because I think that it will clear the make us all aligned for the discussion about the Z tunnel. So it depends on whether it's like TCP or not TCP. If it's TCP, it's the configuration that goes to the network RBAC network filter, and if it's layer 7 attributes like request headers, for example, it's configuration that goes to the HTTP RBAC filter. So, in order to bring that support to the Z tunnel, to the Rust Z tunnel, because we don't have the Envoy filters over there, and we are not even using the XDS for getting the configuration from the pilot. We are only using the new workload API for getting information or metadata, information about workloads running in the mesh. So I'm here mentioning two options. I've concentrated on option 1 over here, and I provided more details and even technical details on option 1 because I think that it's in my opinion, it's the preferred approach, but I wanted to bring it up today just to fail fast. So if you think that, if one of you thinks that this approach is a no-go, and for some reason, then we can consider and discuss and provide more details on other options and develop other options, ideas. By the way, Lynn, I cannot see the chat, so
yeah, there are
like that, so.
There are two hands. Maybe after you go quickly
okay.
over option 1 and 2, we can get to the hands.
Go ahead.
Actually, it was 3 hands. You want to take questions now? I think Carsten, you are up first.
Just wanted to clarify the requirements here. So for Z tunnel, we are only concerned about L4. So L7 is not a relevant factor. And also, I'm not entirely yet clear how much of the network policies that are also L4 policies defined at the Kubernetes level we will need to interact with. That's actually my biggest question. I mean, do we need to consider them, or we can exclude them?
I think we'll definitely have to implement them someday.
Yeah, I would say maybe down the road, but the first phase I would imagine would be supported the existing Istio resources. So to be comparison of the Z tunnel of Envoy base, right? So that the Rust-based Z tunnel can actually be the default, right? Does the Envoy-based Z tunnel already have implementations for super simple L4?
Internal proto, though, could be potentially one proto internally used for network policy and authorization policy, right? Or maybe not. I mean, it's worth looking into.
It's worth.
My intuition is that they probably can be represented as the same, and what we have in this proto here that's defined is probably pretty close to network policy already. I think it's worth looking into. We don't necessarily have to implement that part now, but it's good to think about, I think.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about it, and the requirements that, with Z-tunnel, you want that behavior to be transparent with Kubernetes. So basically, if you have Kubernetes working, you deploy Z-tunnel, it should work exactly like before and not break anything. And I believe now we may break network policy in some cases because we use a different port and it's a different interception. In some cases, we may, depending on how network policy is implemented by Kubernetes. In the past, we were protected because we were on the same port and the network policy was accidentally working and not breaking by us, not broken by us. But anyway, it's probably a separate topic from what XDS protocol we have, but want to make sure we take into account.
Yeah, that's a good comment. Let me capture that in the notes.
And what we're discussing here is just the API between the control plane and the Z tunnel. We're not discussing modifying the user-facing CRD, right?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well-
that is the intent. Yes.
I mean, from user experience point of view, there will be change because, I mean, we will have to notify them that the behavior, I mean, that the rules that they are writing in the authorization policies are going to be deployed only if they have the waypoints deployed. If they
Yeah,
don't have those.
That's sort of a known behavior change between regular mode and ambient mode is that L7 enforcement as a whole, whether it's policy, load balancing, etc., only happens if you have a waypoint deployed. We're looking at adding analyzers to alert the user to that fact. But I'm just wanting to make sure we're not creating even more differences between the two modes.
Yeah, makes sense. Ethan, sorry, I just realized we haven't got to you yet. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's okay. So if I'm reading the document correctly, we're attaching the RBAC policy to the workload object. That
Yes.
it might be the right decision, but it's surprising to me. Why wouldn't there just be an RBAC table that does a match on the traffic and then makes a decision, and the source or dest workload could be part of that match? But would that be a little bit more general and easier to adapt to network policy when we get to it? Yeah.
I feel like you may have touched on two different things, at least from my perspective. Like there's whether we shove this RBAC into the workload or take it out as a separate thing and reference it, like normalizing or denormalizing in database land, right? I'm not sure I'm not sure the network policy connection. Could you explain that a bit more?
Oh, I'm just saying we're imposing a kind of schema on the network policy by segregating it by workload. On the RBAC by segregating it by workload, which works for the kind of RBAC we're currently considering. But my read is network policy is more general. So this schema might become more problematic in the network policy land. I don't know that
I
that's
see. Yeah, I think there's probably actually, so this doc mentions two options. It's like separate API or not separate. But in separate, there's kind of two methods, right? The actual RBAC object could say, what does this apply to? Like label selectors or whatever. Or it could just be a list of policies, and the workload could just reference those by name and say, like, this workload uses policies A, B, and C. I think that's where I was getting confused because I was assuming the latter.
Yeah, I don't think we want to change the selection idiom, right? Like Kubernetes network policy and Istio RBAC are both workload attached, right, by label selection.
okay.
So
that's yeah, and we're not going to do anything other than those two things, so that's fine then.
yeah, I put in comments. I mean, we already have a mechanism to do this in XDS. I mean, have the XDS over MCP. So if the user is querying for the policy object, like whatever full qualified name, it will work out of box today, and you should be able to get all the policies that are relevant to you. That's probably broken. I mean, it was on the to-do list, but I don't think it was implemented, but we can easily fix it. So we may not need additional protocols because you already have a protocol that zTunnel or anyone can use to ask PSTOD to return all the resources of a particular type.
And that's returning like the format of authorization policy user.
It's returning
effort?
yes, it's returning the resources as they are stored in Kubernetes. which is actually good because they are higher level and we don't need to reverse engineer whatever transformation we do to generate the envoy filters.
Just
And
to
it's-
make sure that I understand you, Costin, so you want the Z tunnel to process the authorization policy resources?
I mean, zTunnel will need to process something. It could either reverse engineer from the envoy filters that we generate whatever was original intent and kind of implement it, or it can take Istio policy as they are and implement them. Either way, we need to write some code that is, applying the rules.
Well, there's also, I mean, it's not just Envoy API or Istio authorization policy, right? We can pre-compute, like to some point, either the control plane and the data plane do some processing, right? And
Yep.
we have to find the right balance of the control plane doing a reasonable amount of work, sending a reasonable amount of info on the wire, and then the data plane doing a reasonable amount of work to process that, right?
That's good point, but what I was trying to say, we are not forced to use whatever Envoy internal representation has, because Envoy does some optimization or whatever in control plane or some translations, because they have the network listener whatever model. In zTunnel, we may or may not want to do the same thing, but we have the choice to use the original object and just implement it without translation, or we can split it between control plane and data plane as it's simpler, not necessarily.
I'm
I don't know.
not familiar with this API, but for example, can I query this API for all the authorization policies, resources that are relevant to my workloads? I mean,
So
or am I going to get the whole world and I need to like go over the selectors over there and choose what are the
yeah, that is on the to-do list. That was
relevant.
on the to-do list, unfortunately. I mean, I don't think it was implemented. I think someone was working on it. I don't know if it was finished or not, but it's used in the debug. I mean, all the Istio cattle is using this, and the idea was, to return only the selectors that apply to your particular workload or service account. But it's not difficult to implement. I mean, the only problem is, again, you don't want to filter it and to send all kind of redundant data and push redundant data. But it's a relatively small change, and it will not require protocol change, just implementation change in Istio to do the filtering.
I would suggest that like whatever we do send on the wire, it be kind of declarative rather than what Envoy does and basically send the programming logic for exactly how to configure Envoy the way it is today.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying, Nathan.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what Yossi has is also declarative, right? It's just, is there any existing protocol we could leverage, which what Costin was mentioning about the MCP over XDS? There may be something we can reuse or enhanced. Louis, you have a hand.
I think for the moment I would prefer not to send the protoized versions of the CRDs. I think we probably want there to be a more concretely defined contract between zTunnel and the control plane. I agree about it being declarative, and I agree that we shouldn't send every resource in the universe, so there should be some balance in the control plane and the data plane. The control plane's job is to make the data plane easy.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, if it's easier, if we can send a prototype that it's easier to process in Rust, I completely agree. My concern, just like Nate, was not necessarily Envoy representation. May not be.
No. Yeah, no, we need to design the resource for this.
Yeah,
But
exactly. A new proto.
But maybe the existing proto could be processed. I mean, it's not very complicated. I mean,
Yeah, no, like they may be very close. I suspect
Yeah.
because there may be evolving CRD representations, right? And there may be C-tunnel versions, right, where this thing changes over time, and it's the control plane's job to figure out how to make those two things compatible.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we should give Yossi a chance to go over the two options for folks who hasn't previewed the doc.
Oh yeah, I think that most of the people here already got the idea. But the main idea over here is that the the same workload API that we have today that returns the metadata about the workloads. And today, by the way, it returns the workloads for the whole mesh. I mean, not only the ones that are local to the Z tunnel, but for this use case, we may want to enrich the workloads only that are local. We don't want the policies for a workload running on a different node. For the reasons that we are going to apply policies which are relevant or selected for the workloads that are running on the current Z tunnel, and specifically for this Z tunnel that got the workloads from the control plane. So mainly, I mean, there is we already have the workload protobuf today. Z tunnel is already getting that and requesting for the workloads. The idea is to have a new field over here, which with a new RBAC message. And this RBAC message is described over here. I began with a slightly different definition, but then I saw that the snippets of the code that John had in the issue were mentioning slightly different concepts over there. So I tried to align with those. I mean, those were snippets that are, I believe, came from the Golang implementation of the Z tunnel. So it's not implemented yet in the. There is no implementation yet in the Rust Z tunnel, but there was an attempt over there to implement that. So it's more. I mean, this model is pretty much trying to align with that. The idea is to have, this is the message, the RBAC message that we will have in the returned workload message. Local workloads only will have that information. And inside there, we will have like the allow policies and deny policies. Both of them are the same types, but we differentiate between allow and deny, of course. The RBAC policy is going to have the rules and when clauses. The rules are more for the principals, source namespace, principal, source IP, and remote IP. It can be one of those, and it can be not value. I mean, this is very similar to what we have in Envoy, but it's not as abstract as we have in the Envoy filter configuration. We are more tightly, more leaning toward the what we are supporting and what we have in Istio authorization policies today, and the supported types of policies or rules. And the when is more about the policies. So it can be, I mean, the one when rules can be like either the destination port or destination IP, and also can be not value. So if you specify a rule based on destination port, you can specify that it's not everything but that port number. Let me see if I have any. Okay, many raised hands.
Yeah, John.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, so more on the topic of putting it in workload rather than the specific proto, which I think are kind of two separate things. If you scroll down a little bit, I have a comment on the side that will make it easier to explain. Yeah, that one. So I think putting in a workload is just not going to scale. Like if we consider having, I don't know, 100 policies in each system namespace that apply globally, anytime one of those policies change, if we do this, we're going to have to push all the policies to all the pods, or not to all the pods, but times all the pods for the workloads. If we were to move it to its own API, we would only have to push that one updated policy to each of its nodes. That's going to end up being quite a bit smaller change, I think. Actually, that's actually not true. It's actually just single policy times one, as the other one's already times nodes. So yeah, I think it's just not going to scale really well. That's all, really.
Yeah, that's a good feedback. So it's basically, if you have 10 pods, 10 workloads on this particular node zTunnel manages, whenever there's a change, you would have like the 10 workloads inside of them. You have to have updated RBAC rules. Well, if we use option 2, it would just be one update. Ethan, you want to go next?
Yeah, I don't. So just looking at the proto, why is there a distinction between rule and win? Like the destination IP and the destination port, why isn't that just part of the rule?
Is Liam in here?
Sorry, it took me a while to find the unmute.
Did the question
No,
make sense?
Yeah, I mean, there's no specific. I mean, that this is just conceptually.
But yeah,
Drive
just
the
conceptually,
discussion.
why isn't it?
I mean,
just,
I guess Louis was asking Nimin because that's a legacy from our
no,
authorization policy, right? It has this
is that just
rule
like a
and
weird
when.
like? Okay.
And OTC policy was actually from, to, and when, not just
Right.
to. I would agree that we don't necessarily need to represent. I mean, we may
But
want to,
from-
but we may not necessarily need to represent those in our internal API. But also, I don't think this can be mapped from as is from the internal API, because currently we have lists of lists that represent like the and then the or. So you could say like namespaces is foo or bar, and IP is, I don't know, 1 or 2, right? So we can't exactly represent that in this proto. I think it's probably close to what we want, but we would need a few tweaks.
Yeah, so I maybe, and actually Stephen has a comment that captures this. We want to think about what the zTunnel is actually doing and pass down the simplest representation for the zTunnel to process. Like we don't want the zTunnel code to have a step where it's kind of doing a bunch of thinking to convert into some other representation. So the more we can simplify the classification, the better. That's the kind of meta point. But I'll just let that float.
Yeah, to me, I mean, it's kind of a balance between control plane complexity, zTunnel complexity, and the wire cost. Wire cost and zTunnel are much more important than control plane complexity, I think. But I'm not sure between those two. I think for those, there's not a clear hierarchy. Like they need to be balanced, right?
But that's not a high cost. I mean, it's you can send 100 policies to one pod at startup. They don't change very often. It's not the same thing with the workload where you want IP to be as fast as possible and as small as possible.
Sure. Yeah, I just mean the easiest thing for zTunnel, I guess, is like sending a list of 4 tuples to deny or something, which is an unbounded list, right? So that's obviously not viable. So there's some balance. We'll have to find what that is.
Actually, that was the point I was trying to. Sorry, I went ahead, but it's closely related. I think it is possible to split actually the policy. I mean, to have a very simple policy that is implemented by zTunnel, and if the user has something more complicated, to move to waypoint, basically to force the user to use waypoints, because who knows, maybe zTunnel will be implemented in kernel, additional eBPF magic. Who knows what will do. And some things like a list of things to reject, approve. I mean, some things can be efficiently implemented and move to kernel, eBPF, and the fancy stuff, while others may force us to use the Rust implementation and do complicated things. So we have the option to fork it, to split it.
Yeah. So I will make sure we got some of the hands from our newer folks. Sudi, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I was basically trying to understand this from a different perspective. So basically trying to relate it with CNI. At this point in time, there are situations where we already have network policy, and whenever there are two pods trying to talk to each other, we don't allow it. So a user actually need to put a network policy. So would it mean that in case they want to do another level of RBAC, they would need to write another CRD, which is being proposed here, or how do they interplay?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I can take a stab at this. I guess one way is to think about Z-tunnel potentially as a CNI, right? So it depends on whether you have a CNI on your system that you want to enforce network policy. So you could, if you do, maybe you don't use layer 4 authorization policy from Z-tunnel. If you prefer to use that from your CNI. If you don't have a CNI though, you would just you could use Z-tunnel as your layer 4 policy enforcement, and the initial step we're looking at is supporting existing Istio API, which is the authorization policy we've been discussed here. If the community have desire to support network policy natively in Z-tunnel, that could potentially be option down the road. It's just in the first pass we were thinking support the Istio native API first.
Okay, yeah, understood. I mean, just to bring it up, right? So presently, we definitely have users to write the network policy, and the less CRDs we basically have to write would be better. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, totally. Justin, you raised the hand for a while.
Oh no, it's just we actually had a little bit of the conversation in the side chat, but Costin seemed to be implying that we may want to reduce the L4 policies even further than maybe are currently defined. I just thought maybe we should discuss that a little bit, because if it's going to be too complex to implement in the kernel, for example, we definitely don't want to end up in a situation where the user needs to know which Z-tunnel they're using, and then they get different sets of policies depending on that. So I think we need to figure out what the common set is.
Yeah, that's a great point. Costin, do you see any fields in here maybe that's not appropriate for other Z-tunnel implementations?
I don't know, but I think we need to review them from this perspective. I mean, if someone who have expertise in eBPF and you know, whatever the kernels are doing should take a look and see, and maybe start with the smallest set. I mean, maybe network policy equivalent, which is probably the minimum, and then add more if we confirm it can be implemented. I'm just pointing that we have the option and we should keep it on the table and consider it, because the more we do in the kernel, and the better it is for everyone. John?
Yeah, I was just like, what specifically are you worried about in the API that would be challenging to do in the kernel?
Nothing in particular. It's just someone who is familiar with the BPF should take a look and you know, kind of evaluate if it's feasible and keep the option on the table. I mean, if we are comfortable with the entire thing can be moved, wonderful.
Okay,
we have existence proofs, right, Costin? Like this API is specified, or at least the set of attributes being reasoned about here is strictly a subset of the ones available in Kubernetes network policy, and Cilium claims to implement all of them in eBPF.
That's why I mentioned network policy is the baseline. I mean, if everything is a subset, then we are good. I don't know if they have deny and allow and the entire set of they do, then we are good. And the
Kubernetes,
attributes, basically.
Kubernetes network policy doesn't currently have workload
Cilium network policy does.
The workload selector, is that what you're asking?
No. Workload identity.
Oh, identity. Yes, Cilium has it too.
Right, but the one thing we are never giving up is identity, right? Like it's the whole premise of the product. So that's non-negotiable.
That's our differentiator.
It can be represented as an attribute, as a label in network policy. So if we confirm that it's indeed a strict subset of what Cilium implements, then that's completely addressed my concern. Basically, it's exactly what I was looking for too.
Okay, yeah, let's take a action item for that. I think it makes sense to. And I honestly, for now, what Yossi has, I think definitely is a subset, but it's worth double checking. Ethan, I think you are up next for the Espas hand.
Yeah, this is maybe a pretty significant change in subject, so, but I'll just throw it out there. So if we're not literally putting the policy in the workload, how would it be structured? Would there be a giant table of RBAC policies and workload is a matching attribute? That gets complicated unless you're good at implementing packet classification. Would there be a policy table per workload and some way of pointing a workload to a particular table? Could they share them somehow? Like, this is sort throughable, but the details matter a lot. So I just wanted to flag that.
Yeah, that's what I intended to capture as options 2 and 3, the 2 different ones. I don't have a strong opinion right now, and I don't know that I've heard anyone else express one.
Well, Ethan, it sounds like you're asking me a very internal implementation detail specific question, right? So this is not about the user-facing API at all.
I'm asking about how the API that zTunnel exports is structured. Yes, not about the user-facing API.
Okay.
But I'm concerned about, we don't want to end up in an API where irrelevant changes cause massive control plane updates.
Right. So today, all of the authorization policy APIs are ingress only, and they're for scope to receiving workload within the context of the namespace.
Okay.
Now, the distribution of workloads across nodes is going to require that you propagate any change that would affect a workload running on that node to that node. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a given.
So if we have 2 workloads in the same deployment, would they that have exactly the same RBAC policies, would there be one table and each workload would point to that table? Or would there be 2 RBAC policy tables, one for each workload?
We can optimize.
I'm thinking one. Yeah.
Okay,
I don't actually know, and I think you're probably going to want
know.
to test to figure out the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, by the way, whoever is taking notes here, you do a much better job than me. Thank you.
Right. If the control plane know, right, your options are, does the control plane know what workloads are running on the node? If so, it will send down only the policies that are for workloads running on that node. And then does the control plane do the additional step of collating for each individual one and producing a table, or just sending down the ones for each workload in the match, and it's up to zTunnel to perform some local matching, right?
Right. That's a big question.
I don't know if it's going to have that much impact on performance, though, right?
No. It just, while we're talking about the API to the zTunnel, it's like the key. Like from a performance perspective, zTunnel can restructure these tables internally however it wants, right? So you could have a giant table with a match, and you could implement that as in, So
I would suggest, if you can tolerate it, that you take one update per one external facing resource update, rather than collating, because it's easier to reason about the scale of the system.
Do you mean correlate in the zTunnel itself then, in that case?
Yeah.
That's option 3 then. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the downside with option 2 really is that if you add or remove policies, then you have to go update a bunch of workloads. So you're just uploading, or you're updating a small thing. It's just a reference rather than the full rule, but it's still more.
With
Hopefully
respect
that's
to
one.
the scaling issue for option 1, I mean, obviously option 1 is probably the simplest in this sense, because there's no mapping required, right, between these structures. Like as far as the scale problem is concerned, what is the issue? Is it the amount of data sent? Is the amount of round trips? Because
one is weird because one is the user-facing API.
No, it's not only
No,
the
no,
scale,
no.
it's
No, inline
the
versus-
direction.
No, it's not. It's not right.
So Nate, the issue is that let's say we do compare option 3 to 1, right? If I change one policy in option 3, I just push that new policy down to the Z tunnel, right? So I don't know, policy is what, 500 bytes or something maybe. I push that to all the nodes, so I push, I don't know, 500 bytes times nodes. If we inline it, we now, and say that policy applies to every workload, which is fairly common because you have these root namespace rules, right? Anytime one of those change, we need to go update all the workloads. We need to update all the policies because they're all aggregated there. I may have hundreds of policies.
Yeah.
So now I have hundreds of policies times 500 bytes, times the number of workloads, times the number of nodes, because we need to send it to all the Z tunnels as well, right? So it's every small change results in having to push a massive amount of config. This is why Istio doesn't scale today with sidecars, right?
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I was just it'd be good, I think, like in this doc probably to kind of spell that out when discussing option 1.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, we had the exact same problem with service as well. Today we effectively inline service. I think that with future changes, that's probably going to want to change. So similar discussions will need to be had there.
Yeah, the last
Eitan,
thing
go ahead.
I want to bring up is like the simplicity of the Z tunnel itself, right? Like one of the reasons sidecars don't scale is because you have to send, it's declarative, right? It's not smart. You send a ton of config, right? And so I do think, the more logic, the smaller the config, the more logic we have to actually write into the tunnel, which means the more complex it gets. Not necessarily good or bad, just, we always have to think about our goal of keeping the Z tunnel as simple as possible.
Ethan, should you go ahead?
Yeah, this is more of a longer term thing. I just wanted to flag, and I might have a little bit of post-traumatic stress from a previous job, but I'll just note that in the actual implementation, the actual classification of this, I would expect to be a major performance bottleneck, particularly in cases at the point where we're like forwarding packets. Traditionally, packet classification, if there's going to be a lot of RBAC policies, can be pretty slow. So just when we get to the point of writing it, just like be aware that that's something we're probably, the actual like decision of which policies match, we're going to have to rewrite to be more performant later. And just like keep that in mind, because that part is probably going to get shoved out with a highly optimized thing later. And again, this may come from spent years of my life working on this in a different context, so I may be over indexing on it, but just wanted to flag it.
And that's highly optimized, maybe replacing upstream, or maybe it's as an extension provided by a vendor.
I don't know, but there's a good chance that the performance of the actual lookup is going to matter.
Yeah, evaluating the full suite of policies for every packet, right, is probably a non-starter, right? And we need some optimization to not do that all the time.
Yeah.
And that may be some well-defined heuristic, right, where we have flow identifiers, or we're using some hash of the 5-tuple or something like that to cache, right, for a period of time, right, a policy decision based on the state of the policy from time minus n.
Right. And there are ways to do lookups that are way better than linear traversal. Linear traversal of all the rules for every flow is probably going to be bad for some cases. So just like FYI.
Yeah, this might also jump the gun, but because we're using those connect tunnels, we're a little luckier because we can actually make the decision on first send, basically, and then maintain that connection and not have to make it again.
Yes. Yeah, currently. We start doing more aggregation, and no, but I think you're right.
Okay, should we do a recap? Is there any other feedback, or should we do a recap on action items? Okay, I think my recap, if you guys can add anything I missed, is optional one. People are worried about scalability issue. Option two, there are concerns about the contract between control plane and data plane, whether it needs to be willing still resources. Option three, I think, has been pretty favorable among people. And option four, I'm not sure. Okay, option four, I thought it was option two. I'm sorry. So
I think these are actually orthogonal choices, right? There's representation, right, and then there's delivery.
Yeah, delivery is
Whether
clear. I mean, yeah.
Well, the delivery options are control plane does aggregation or not.
Yeah.
Filtering, not aggregation.
Some form of merging of multiple resources, right?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
There's not one for every user-facing change. There is not one, XDS event sent for each workload that would be affected, right? And option one is an example of composition or aggregation, right? So there are these kind of fundamental principles, right?
Yeah, I understand now what you're saying. I understand option three, so I completely agree with option three. Yeah, one user change should result in one push, basically. Yeah, that's ideal.
Right, and then there's a separate discussion about representation, like use authorization policy directly, which you could create an aggregated version of authorization policy. You can have a disaggregated version of it, right? So that's an orthogonal choice, right? That's representation. So these are not options. Right, you don't choose option 4 versus option 2, right? Like that's not how this works. We choose does control plane aggregate or not, and we choose representation. John, does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, that sounds right to me. It seems like there's a general consensus on a non-directly authorization policy representation with, I don't know, disaggregating. The RBAC selects the workloads. Workload has nothing about RBAC in it. Is that?
Sorry, I'm not sure I quite parsed your last sentence.
So, I mean, there will be two XDS components. One is RBAC, one's workload. The workload doesn't say anything about RBAC. The RBAC actually specifies which workloads it's associated with, whether that's by labels or by direct names or whatever. That's up for.
Yes. It implies that the tunnel has to perform the join.
Yeah.
Or it could just be another match element, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't want to specify exactly how that is done because I think there's a lot of options. And does anyone not agree with that? Sorry, go ahead, Nate.
No, I think everybody agrees with that. We just need to capture that in the doc. And then option 4 would become a separate kind of set of bullets, right? It'd be option 1 of representation. And then the second representation would be some custom proto, right? That we define for the API.
Right.
Just
So you'll
want
see
to make sure, yeah.
So whoever's capturing notes, can you make that change?
I'm capturing some more notes. It's just I got moved on to the next page. So
Yeah, you'll see. So could you refactor the doc into those kind of basic categories, right? Representation and aggregation and delivery.
Yeah, yes, I can. I just want to make sure that I understood it correctly. Option 3 is who is going to like process the selector. So yeah, you have the selector information in the RBAC objects, right? But
You mean
are
in
you
the
going to
user
push?
in the user face? Are you talking about the user facing API or the downward facing API?
Downward.
Okay. Yeah. So
yeah.
Right, zTunnel has to know how to perform some form of selection. At a very basic level, it has to be able to do that. The question is, how complex a selection does it have to do, right? Is it control plane knows workload identity and zTunnel performs hash map lookup, right, over set of a reverse map of workload identities to policies, right, where that map is calculated by the control plane? Or is zTunnel performing a more complicated match than that? Right, and so a more complicated set of criteria to push down.
So is it reasonable that the zTunnel will get an RBAC that is irrelevant to the workloads running on the same nodes?
Well, ideally, it would be relevant, and I would imagine it would have the selector in there, so the zTunnel can figure out which the resources, the internal resource we got, the zTunnel got, can be applied to whichever workload zTunnel is managing by using the selector match.
So who did this job? Is it the control plane? And like before pushing that RBAC's resources, it went over the selectors and chose the right ones?
My understanding of what was discussed is that control plane will filter the resources, so zTunnel will not get any. Yeah,
I think that would be preferred. Yeah.
Right, but should the other question, Carsten, is should the control plane condense the match? Right, the way I described. Right, if the user-facing API, yes, I think it would probably be necessary, actually, for the zTunnel to be able to perform.
Well, if you condense the match, do you mean condense the match with the workload, as part of the workloads, or just build the correlation of the match?
So the user-facing API, right, has a complex label selector, right? The zTunnel knows which workloads run locally. The control plane can run the complex label selection, right, and provide a simplified representation of the match back to the zTunnel, which is basically destination IP to list of policy IDs, right? That's a condensed form of the match.
Okay, so you're thinking the control plane would provide the matching, so the zTunnel just based on the matching link the two together.
Yeah, I don't think you want the zTunnel performing label matches.
Okay, because I thought this must be, it didn't interpret correctly. I thought the match is already, like the selector is already in the workload resource, but probably not yet.
Yeah, and actually what I would suggest that we use is the IP of the destination as the workload identity to key into the identities of the policies.
But if you're doing that, does the control plane really have to kind of segregate it based on IP, or can it just shove down a big? Are you trying to optimize the lookup at runtime, or do you think it's simpler to have it actually segregated?
Well, you have a choice, right? Like, the control plane has to give something that the zTunnel can match on, right? And I think we agree that we don't want it to be workload label selection, because that's a lot of work, and the control plane has all that information. So what simplified match can it provide? You want to do an identity-based match, right?
Yes, the IP or the identity needs to be in every rule.
Yes.
Like the straw man simplest thing is you just have a giant bucket of rules, and every rule must have an IP and or identity in it, and then the control
Yes.
plane figures out how to achieve that.
Right. So effectively, you have a map which is workload identity, which may be an IP or you may be something else, to a list of policies, and you can choose to represent a few different ways, but that's fundamentally what you're doing.
John, you have
Yeah,
a
one
hand for a
concern,
while.
I generally agree with everything you said, Louis. One concern, if we convert the selector into a list of destination IPs, then say we have like 5 global policies, every time a pod spins up, we'll need to push those 5 policies as well as the workload, and same with spinning down, which isn't amazing. Still may be worthwhile, like it's a trade-off.
Yeah, I mean, you might have to do an all, right?
Yeah, that's actually, that's actually, I think, right. So we could have all namespace or a list of IPs. I think that's...
Yeah, that's the hierarchy, I think. Yeah, it's not literally a map. It's probably tree map-like.
Yeah, I'll need to see it. Okay, there's something that's making me uncomfortable, but I'll read the document.
So you need to push back down a policy, and the policy has, this policy applies to everything, so it just has an all. This policy applies to these IPs, or this policy applies to these namespaces, right? And then you could probably very quickly run a match in the Z-tunnel against that structure.
So
yeah,
And that's
if we
small man,
rely,
right? So
oh, sorry. If we rely on destination IP, but the pod has been rescheduled and the IP changed, so I'm just wondering.
The control plane has to push out the change, Iris, right? That's already true if the pod is scheduled.
Yeah, but if we select a service account or something that is fixed, is this well beneficial?
We already use a mapping of IP address to service account, so that's already something that we have to maintain correctly for other reasons, like certificate selection and whatnot.
But it's a very tricky mapping because, you know, IP reuse and all the other stuff. So anywhere we can use identities, it's far more secure.
But this is
So
not about
IPs are-
security, Custom, right? There's a pod. It has an IP. The IP is immutable while the pod is running. The control plane must provide config to the Z-tunnel to satisfy the needs of that pod.
Guys, just to maybe help make progress on the doc, would it make sense to actually split this into 2 docs? The first one that, you know, focuses on making the decision of aggregation, which I think is something that we could just throw together, just, you know, stamp it and mark it as, you know, decision of record. And then we can start going on to this more detailed discussion in that second doc where given we've already agreed that aggregation is the way we want to go, what is the API? Does that help to make progress?
I don't know if it helps because the two have, right? If you're going to do an aggregated representation, then I'd say the downward facing representation might change because of aggregation.
But it seems like we already made that decision, no?
Yeah, I think we're saying we're not going to aggregate the resources. That's the preferred option, right? So one user facing change equals one fanned out change of the control plane. Right, so it's obvious what's happening.
And it's bound and it's small and it's clean. Yeah.
I think what we're saying is you could just put that at the top of the document and make that fixed, and then work on the next part of the document, and the document doesn't grow unbounded by doing that. So at the end, we still have just one document.
Yeah, I'm worried about split because we're trying to decide the contract between the control plane and data plane, right? That split would come together, it still impact the contract. So we want to look at them holistically.
Well, so I guess I don't have a hard and fast rule. So y'all see if you find your documents growing out of control, please split it in 2. If it's not, don't. I think it's actually, and Ethan, I don't know if we have this yet, if we have a more kind of principles of flow in XDS document.
Justin's
Or is it-
working on one.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's really important because we're about to have a crap load of, we're going to build an ad hoc package, man, and we're about to have a mess.
Yeah, I have the proposal I'm working on is specifically for routing, and I do work. I mean, it makes sense to sort of like when you look at it to combine all of these things because it is sort of a general flow classification. But I am worried that we're going to basically build OpenFlow and Open vSwitch again, which is probably not the path we want to go down.
Well, it works. Quick question: are the option exclusive? I mean, sorry. If someone implements a naive implementation using, because Istio is exposing the high-level objects already, a naive implementation using labels, it's possible and it's relatively easy, not optimal, and it could get us out of the door, and then we can work on the because IR intermediate representation will require a lot of work to stabilize to make it optimal and a lot of design. I don't think it will be something that we can do as fast as a naive implementation. And then we can switch because again, there is no major harm in optimizing later. That was the main reason I was suggesting using the high level representation, because again, naive implementation is super easy to do and not may allow us to release faster.
I think
So if you
custom.
release with it though, how do you I guess migrate? Is it
There's no migration. I mean, the only thing the intermediate representation will do is to take the high level representation which you already expose and provide a more efficient hashes or whatever. So it will be no migration. Any old code will still use, because that's something we already expose. I mean, we expose a high level API over XDS. So anyone can use them directly with a naive implementation. And when we have better IRs, and that may evolve, I mean, over different releases, we'll keep adding IRs that are more and more optimized. So it's additive.
I don't know. The one thing I would say about that custom is I'm not sure we want to increase the intra-control plane complexity. Right, so let's say we do push label selection down into ztunnel. That means that ztunnel has to be given other information to perform that function. Right, I'd rather pick a degenerate simple one that we could optimize later and change the IR. Right, that still kept ztunnel simple, than create a situation where we're depending on cross API or even environmental behaviors to make this work. You see what I'm saying?
I mean, I have my concerns about labels as well. My question is if we think that we can completely avoid labels. I mean, if there is any reason to have the labels, then the naive implementation becomes, super
right, so
easy.
like a naive implementation is we send down a merged table for each pod IP that's currently running on the node. Right?
No.
That's pretty naive.
We know the labels. We don't send anything because the labels are already available. So since we have them from the pods, so we don't need to send the labels.
Customer, how are we getting them from the pods?
For the peer or for the local pod?
The local pod.
Local pod, I think kubelet, or I think they're exposed in.
So then we have to go and have a kubelet dependency, right? We have to do all these.
Oh,
things.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, no. PTR discovery service, the IP discovery service is, it can return labels, so we can get both for source and destination. We can get the labels.
Right, but you see what I'm saying, right? That's creating a dependency between two different APIs.
Yes, it creates a dependency between IP and the discovery service returning labels, which is.
Yeah, so let's try not to do that. That's caused us headaches in the past.
No, I agree. If we can avoid labels, completely agree. But if for any reason we'll need to work with labels and get the labels in the discovery service for telemetry for other purposes, then why not?
Well, I'd rather keep telemetry. Like, I don't want telemetry to force a dependency into routing.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, let's try to avoid labels if we can.
All right. I think we're way over time. Thank you so much for the great discussion. John, thank you for taking some really nice notes too. Thank you, Yossi, for presenting. Any parting words anyone wants to say?
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye now.
See ya.
Thank you.